In the most entrepreneurial part of the UK, Cambridge, there are only a few companies that have become truly global icons. But with revenues of over 600 million last year, 1,700 employees, and a technology that powers almost 100% of mobile phones, the subject of today is arguably Cambridge's greatest business success. The company's name is Arm. I sat down with Tudor Brown, president of Arm, to find out how it all started over 20 years ago, what he's learned, and if there are any threats on the horizon for Arm's seemingly impregnable business model.
I want to take you back to what Robin Saxby calls 13 engineers in a barn.
Yeah.
Tell me, how did Arm start?
Well, Arm was a spin-out originally from Acorn. So the Arm technology started in 1983 in Acorn Computers. And the mission at that time was or the aim, if you like, was to build a more powerful BBC computer. If you remember, back in those days, Acorn had the BBC computer. Mm-hmm. It was an 8-bit machine, and the challenge was to build something of higher performance. And we looked around at the upcoming 16-bit microprocessors at the time, and we concluded they were all inadequate in terms of the cost and the performance benefits that they gave. And so Acorn was a sort of entrepreneurial sort of company at that time. And so the mission was, let's build our own microprocessor. And that started in 1983. 1987, we launched the first product based on that technology. By then, though, Acorn had got into financial trouble and couldn't really afford to keep us as a bunch of engineers.
Talk me through the people that are kicking around at this time, because there are some great Cambridge names, aren't there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, back in those days, there were the two major computer companies in Cambridge. There was Acorn and there was Sinclair, and there was rivalry between them, and there were the famous stories about the fights in the Mitre and so on. But Acorn was the biggest and the most successful of those, and Acorn itself spawned a lot of spin-offs. It was a very entrepreneurial time in the early 80s at that time. And there were lots of spin-offs from Acorn, and in fact you can trace back many companies that are in Cambridge today that in some way had their roots in Acorn, whether it was the people or some of the base technology or whatever. And so, yeah, it was a very interesting time. Of course, I was working in Acorn at that time, and it just seemed, well, that's the job, you know. Yeah. I didn't see all this other stuff going on around, really.
Yeah. What was you talk about the sort of entrepreneurial atmosphere. I love the fact that there wasn't a powerful enough microprocessor, you guys decided to build it yourself. I mean, would you say that's it's a very Cambridge thing to do, isn't it, really?
You could say so. I mean, you have to give the credit to Herman Hauser for that. He was the sort of visionary at the time. He was leading Acorn at that time, and he used to travel around the world a lot. And he came back from Stanford and concluded that actually building a microprocessor with this new RISC approach couldn't be that difficult. And so he drove that first project.
Sure. Now, Arm has got one of probably the most well-renowned business model. How did that come about? First, explain what it is, and then how did it come about?
So the Arm business model is one of licensing. It's what we now call the IP business model. So we license technology to people to manufacture things. So the license is to design and to manufacture. And then every time these companies, the semiconductor companies, manufacture a product, they pay us a small royalty. And so that's the basic business model. Now that came about because when the company was formed in 1990, the joint venture company, it was obvious to us, based here in Cambridge, that we had technology that competed with many other companies like Motorola and so on. Yes. And so it would have been fairly foolish and difficult for us at that time, from Cambridge, from the UK, with no industry, to try to be another semiconductor company. And so we had the view that actually we've got technology. What we want to do is make this technology successful on a world stage. And so the best way to do that is to try and license it.
Is there anything out of left field that sort of scares you to a certain extent? Because, you know, as you said, you've got almost 100% of the mobile phone market powered by Arm.
Well, of course things scare us. I mean, we're still a very small company compared to some of the big companies, both our big customers and some of the big companies that want to compete with us. I mean, it's well known that Intel is wanting to compete with us. And right now, things have been very much in Arm's favor. But there's no question Intel's technology is getting better. It is coming closer to where Arm's technology is. And so at some point, we're taking the assumption that eventually Intel will get technology that's as good as us in a worst case scenario from our point of view.
Yes.
If that's the case, we've still got to win. So how do we win? It's through the business model, and that's the way we think about these.
I mean, you've been called a new economy company. I mean, the phrase is you don't manufacture, you design, you don't sell, you license. Do you think that model is scalable in other industries as well?
Well, actually, very few people have managed to make a good business out of the IP business model in electronics. It is clearly possible because we managed it, but there aren't many cases where it clearly works. It is quite popular and common in other industries, such as the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah. So again, another big industry here in Cambridge, quite a lot of companies are engaged in developing and licensing technology. So it has parallels, and I guess we'd say that Dolby in the music industry was a classic case of somebody who did that many, many years ago. And so it does happen, but in the electronic semiconductor world, it's proved very hard for many other companies to get really successful doing that.
Take me back to 1990. So Robin Saxby is your MD, I think. Mm-hmm. How do you go about winning your first few customers? Because you're a tiny company in Cambridge, although you do have some great connections, perhaps via Herman.
We had technology. That was the good thing. We had proof of concept. So all of the Acorn computers, which weren't successful in a global sense, were great demonstrators of our technology. So that was an important thing. We were a startup, but we didn't have to start off by developing our first product, which so many startups have to do. We had a running start in actually having something to demonstrate. Okay. So the challenge was to convince companies that it was better for them to use this technology than to develop their own. Mm-hmm. And it was very clear to us from the beginning. And Robin came in. He was not one of the founders, if you like, but he came in very soon after that and drove the company. And it was very clear to him, and he made it very clear to us, that we had to be an international company. We would only succeed if we succeeded on a world stage here. And it turned out that I mentioned that there was another company, a minority interest company in the joint venture, a company called VLSI Technology. They were actually our first licensee. Mm-hmm. We realized we needed to get more licensees because that was the only way the company was going to grow. So we started close to home with the only UK electronics company left at that time, long since gone, but GEC Plessey. And so that was our first license deal. And that took over a year to get that first deal. And so those were very, very lean times. We were running as a very, very lean startup. And we had our first deal after just over a year. And in parallel with trying to get that deal, we knew we had to, as I say, be on an international scale. We had one US licensee. We had a European licensee coming. So we set about trying to get a Japanese licensee. And so because of the Apple connection, we chose Sharp. There was some linkage there with Apple. Yeah. And so we got a license with Sharp in Japan. And that took another 2 years. And so the first licensees were really very thin on the ground, if you like.
Just on a personal level, I mean, did you think, God, this might not work?
Oh, absolutely. We assumed it wouldn't work. That was the nature of our British Cambridge attitude, right? Oh, well, here we go again. This will never work, but never mind. It's fun. Let's make a go of it. And that was kind of the attitude that had been bred into us in a way in Acorn, because many of us have been working in Acorn for many years, where we'd created some great technology, but commercially it had been a flop. Yeah. And indeed, the first products that were based on ARM, when ARM set out as a separate company, were all flops commercially. And it was a set of serial flops. I can list them. There was the Acorn computers, which were clearly not really successful. There was the Apple Newton, which was the first sort of PDA, which was the whole raison d'etre for the company. That was clearly a flop. There was the 3DO multiplayer, which was the first CD-based games machine in the world, based on ARM, commercial flop. Mm-hmm. There was the Sega Dreamcast games machine. That was a flop. And so it went on. And so all the early products, great, we got this great company, you know. Yeah. And we were kind of used to that. So it was a very important point that we were running the company as a bunch of pessimists, very lean and mean, on the basis that we weren't going to build the company up on the hope of some future growth. We were going to run the company on the basis that what we had today had to last.
I mean, talk me through some of the mistakes you made.
Oof. No, we never go
It's a
there.
big question. Come on.
That's one of my favorite interview questions, actually. It really throws people off the mark.
Yeah.
Well, as we were young, when we were younger, our first trip into Japan wasn't terribly successful. I think it's fair to say we misjudged how we should pitch the company and so on. And quite a few of our early presentations were far too technical and not commercial enough, as you might expect.
Yep.
PowerPoint written by a bunch of engineers, you get focusing on the technical details, and so there's that sort of thing. Later on, as the company has grown, I think we've been slow to embrace some of the changes needed in being an international company. We're still a very Cambridge-centric philosophy company, and although we're international, less than half our people are now in the UK. There's a feeling within the company that we're a bit too concentrated in our philosophy in the UK, and we need to spread as we go further.
Do you think having, almost no money and no people, do you think that was a benefit?
I think it's great. It's not always appropriate. There are some cases where it clearly doesn't work. You have to have large capitalization. Yeah. But for what we were doing, it taught us a lot of lessons. It taught us to be lean and mean, not just in the company, but in our whole philosophy for how we design the ARM microprocessor. It's fundamental to the DNA of this company that we don't go out, and even today, although we're much bigger, we still run very tight budgets.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, obviously, revenues now are huge compared with starting then. Do you have the same mindset?
Absolutely.
When you go into a meeting?
Because expectations on us are very high. Yes, we're a bigger company than we were, and yes, you could say we're making a lot more money than we were, but the expectations of us now as a public company are that we should be a highly profitable company. Yeah. That is the only way in which we can fund our large R&D program and give our shareholders back the returns they expect. And so the expectations on us are to remain very profitable. And therefore we don't go out profitably spending money on things that are just fun. We are quite tight.
What achievement are you personally most proud of?
Well, I think most of us are pretty proud of the fact that actually we've taken a technology that's based in the UK, that started here in the UK. Yep. We've grown it into a world success, a world phenomenon, if you like. And as a company, we are a huge net exporter from the UK. So we're doing our bit for the UK. Now, you may think that sounds a bit sort of wet, but actually I'm a fundamental believer that wealth creation is through trading, and the UK has to be a trading nation. We have to export. And here we've created something that is making a major contribution. Yes.
I mean, we're not going to manufacture in the UK, are we? And
never again. Clearly not. The last semiconductor companies have closed their doors or whatever. But there's still huge wealth to be created, and there are other IP companies in the UK. Mm-hmm. There are other companies around Cambridge that are doing similar things that are also exporting, and great, good luck to them.
It's an interesting question because, for example, what would your advice be to entrepreneurs in the UK who want to create wealth?
My view on this is very public and very clear. You have to export. Because to a first approximation, there's no industry here in the UK that's of interest. That's not quite fair, but take it to a first approximation. The markets are in the US and in the East, and you've got to get out there and you've got to export. And if you take that ballsy approach, there is definite rich pickings to be had, but you've got to be confident in doing that.